Hello, I'm Jason Skill and this is lesson 4, Painting with Skill Watercolour. Hi, what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at mixing devices. First of all, let's look at the flat mixing devices on the market and we'll talk about the pros and cons of flat mixing. A very first starting point of flat mixing, which a lot of artists try, is the idea of glass or perspex. What they'll do is they'll squeeze the paint out onto the glass or perspex and then they can manipulate the paint on that flat surface. The advantage that that gives is that basically you have a reasonable area to manipulate the brush. So I've squeezed out a couple of colours here. I've got a French ultramarine and a burnt umber, and I can touch the paint at its edge. These both have dried on the surface already, and I can manipulate it. So I can make blue, I can touch at the edge of the brown, and I can work the two together to make whatever colour I intended. If you've got freshly squeezed out colour, so let's put some more of the blue on top there, so that's the French ultramarine. Let's put the top back on, always put the top back on your colours. If I do that, I can then use a much more heavy paint. Now notice how, if I've freshly squeezed out this colour, I do not pick it up and put it somewhere else. The idea of mixing on the flat, really, the main advantage of it is that you can tease the colour from its edge. You can touch it at its edge and manipulate that out. Even if it's brand new and fluid, you know, people are tempted to sort of pick it up and then kind of stir it round. You've no idea now how much paint you've got on your brush, and if you look very closely here, what you can see is I've got a great big globule of blue on the brush, and that's not good news, because when you're painting you then might put that, you know, very intensely in an area of a picture which you didn't intend. So you then got to work it round and round and round, or maybe even put it in the water pot and try to wash that out. So picking the colour up and putting it somewhere else can sometimes, if it's freshly squeezed out, not be a good idea. You're best to tease it from its edge so that you can control the colour. Now if you're using a much bigger brush, here I'm using a Hake. This is a very wide brush. It enables me to basically, because I've got loads of space on the flat, I can mix the colour working between these two, and I've got a mountain of space to manipulate the hair, get the colour I want, and get the feel of brush that I want. And working on the flat, that is the main advantage. It's space to play with the brush to get it how you want before you place it on the paper. The disadvantage would be if I started to make a whole load of paint here, it may be that this just basically runs wherever it likes. It's also very difficult to judge how much fluid and paint I've made, because you've got no receptacle that it's in so that you can judge the depth and how much you've created. It's a bit like spilling milk over the kitchen floor. You have no idea how much fluid you've actually spilled if you had to work out how much it was to put it back in the bottle. So it's a great idea to mix if you want loads of space, but really this kind of mixing you maybe want to look for something with an edge. So what some people then do is they will look at something like this. This is sometimes referred to as a butcher's tray, kind of mixing. A butcher's tray basically was where they used to put the meat and it stopped the blood going out the edges basically. But this is a plastic tray. They often use these in schools. Again, you would squeeze out colour. Same sort of routine, exactly the same idea, and then you've got plenty of space, but you also are not then worrying about the edges. So if this is lent on an angle, then I know that the fluid is going to stop moving when it gets to the edge, whereas with the glass or perspex it's just going to go over that border. People love this. Again, the problem I foresee is that you could say that the advantage is that you can mix the colours how you want, but if you've got a lot of colours, they can intermix with one another and create a colour that you didn't intend. So sometimes you can get quite muddy colour by mixing on the flat, which is why a lot of people spend quite a bit of their time with flat mixing, wiping up what they've made in excess fluid and paint, and then they'll mix new colour. So there's sort of painting and wiping is often the routine that they end up doing. Traditional palette idea, if you want to be a real artiste, you would put this, put your thumb through here. So this is a right hand version. You can get left-hand versions. Can you see if I turn this to a left-hand version, it doesn't feel quite right because now the paint's towards me, whereas there it's away where I'd mix. So if you're left-handed, you probably want a reverse of this. Again, the idea here would be that you would squeeze the paint into one of the receptacles, or all if you're using a variety of colours. You then take the paint from this area and manipulate it on the flat. This is basically oil mixing, and as an oil mixing palette on a small scale, this is actually quite a good idea because this edge stops any excess fluid from basically pouring on you. A bigger palette, often it would be in the crook of your arm, and then you'd find that you sometimes end up with a load of paint down at sort of your elbow where it's maybe dribbled off if using acrylic or oil. Small scale, again, it just stops it dribbling anywhere. How often you actually would paint standing up? Some people do that a lot. Most people who paint with watercolour, actually their palette sits on the table. So although this is a great idea, in some ways, how often you would actually use it, I'm not so sure. The other disadvantage is that often you're then putting your brush into the paint to mix it. So you're picking fluid from the pot and then you're putting it into the paint, and it's basically re-wetting the area. So it's diluting the colour. Unlike if you'd squeeze the paint out on the flat area of this, where you could control, just wipe my fingers, where you could control how much water you're adding. If it's in here, now even if it's fluid, I'm trying to control where that water goes to and stops at that edge. If it's in there, I end up basically pooling into my colour, and then you're into like an old sort of school kiddie kind of thinking where all you're doing is sort of stirring it round to create the colour. So I would be wary of colour in containers, because unless you fill that container to the brim and use it like a pan set, then it doesn't always work very effectively. So let's look briefly at a pan set. Again, this is the cheap kids kind of pan set that I was looking at in the previous video. And what you would do here is you would rub the colour. So the colour's here, and then I lift the colour from here and I place it on to the mixing area. So I'm divorcing the point from where I'm touching the paint to where I'm mixing it. The advantage of the flat mixing is that I'm literally at the edge of my mixing device, my mixing colour, so I can pull that out and manipulate that colour immediately. I'm not going from an area, lifting that and mixing it somewhere else. To me, there was a lot of logic in the flat mixing on glass and Perspex. To kind of adapt the mixing pan set, what some people have done is they've come up with the idea of taking a pan set. Basically, this device looks like a pan set. It's actually a mixing tray. So what you would do is you'd squeeze the colour. Ooh, go. Lost that lid. I'll come back to that later on. And you would touch the colour in there and then pull it into this area. The idea of the lip is obviously so it separates the mixing area from the colour. There's quite a lot of logic to this because basically your colours are kept separately and then you can pull them almost directly into the flat mixing area. This one again adapts for that. Let's all be an artiste and hold it up. So you're then able to take the colour and manipulate it whilst you're holding it. Let's say you're standing up, you're working outside, so it's close to you. The big appeal of any of these kind of pan set mixing ideas where you're putting a whole selection of colours in containers is that you have the same visual excitement as that you have with a pan set, in that all of the colours are there so that you feel you're ready to go. The advantage of one where you squeeze the colours out like this is you can put the lid on. Basically, you don't have to get rid of your colour, which you would if you were using a flat mixing device and taking it outside, otherwise you'd be covering whatever bag or container you'd put it in. So the lid holds the colour in and you just have to wipe away the mixing areas. Again, this one's quite logical in that you can, because it's got a slight ridged edge to that, which on two sides is chamfered, which means cleaning becomes easier. You have the ability to, in some way, create an amount of wash that you can control how much you've made and judge how much you've made. If you are making a reasonable amount of that particular colour, and then mixing it with another, then I can see that being quite a sensible system. If you want to do things on a much larger scale than that, what you would perhaps do is look at something like this. This is an American palette, comes with a lid. So it's taking that previous idea and making it much, much larger, giving you a huge area to mix on. So this is like a big flat plate, like the glass or perspex idea, and then you've got the containers around the edges. The containers around the edges you would fill, again, pretty full. It has a lip so that the colour that's in here that's all moving around doesn't necessarily flow straight into your colour, so it's a separating thing. The advantage obviously is space. If you're into big brush mixing, you can manipulate, you know, to your heart's content on a massive scale with big wide brushes. You could use sponges, anything you like to play in this area. You pull your colour in to work, so you can mix by basically pulling it in from various points into this mixing area. The disadvantage I see is that you have one big mixing area, so that whatever colour you've made, when you've finished with that particular colour, you've got to wipe it up before you then start again. And also, because of the area being large and flat, you have the same problems you have mixing on the flat, on the glass plate, in that basically colours can intermerge. You have no particular separation or compartmentalising of which colours you're using, only in the source point. But, you know, this is immensely popular as a palette form. And there's a lot of variations on that idea. Here's another. Here what we have is, again, loads and loads of points to squeeze out your colour, immensely deep. It would cost you a fortune to fill this with colour, I have to say. And the chamfering idea is so that you can pull your colour in from this direction out into your mixing areas, of which you have 3. So you could say that it's advantageous compared to the previous one in that you have 3 separate mixing areas, so you can create 3 different washes or types of colour while you're mixing. Again, this is nice and rounded around the edges, or cleaned off so that you can easily wipe and clean it out. Disadvantages would be, it's the same thing for me, that you now have a container, so that the colour, just like it did with the pooling, mixed into the dished area in this old style mixing device, you're going to have the same problem. So as you're adding water in and mixing, you're perhaps then repooling and re-wetting your colour. By mixing it and filling it to the lip, you're just creating basically an enormous pan set with 3 mixing devices. If that's what you want, then that's great. And there are so many variants on this. Here we have one that's round, well, oval. Differing sizes of mixing. Space pan areas where you'd fill these with colour. You could fill these with colour and then use these 3 as a mixing area. So if I turn it around that way, these could become little pan mixing areas and one larger mixing area. The good idea of this is the idea of like a gasket. So basically when you put the lid on, once you've wiped up the excess colour in the middle, then you're going to be able to move around without that much worry about paint spilling out the edges. So, flat mixing. You have one big advantage, and that is space. You can mix with whatever size of tool you like, because the mixing device is pretty big. Disadvantages, it has a tendency to blend, colours move into one another, and that may and may not be what you're after at certain points in the mixing. You may want to be able to compartmentalise, you may want to be able to pre-mix colours, think about what you're doing and not necessarily have to wipe up that colour and leave those colours in different separate compartments, which when we look next at container mixing is the basic theory behind container mixing, that you'd mix different colours in different containers and then you would have those to hand when you needed them. The disadvantage of container mixing often is that the containers may not be the right size if you're using a larger tool. What you really want is to be able to take the advantages from flat mixing and container mixing in one device. So, flat mixing, basically you've got a big area, but watch out, are you really wanting a pan set on a large scale? Or do you want to be able to control the colour literally at the edge point, as I showed you when we were mixing on the flat with the first Perspex plate. To me, that's the most logical way to control the paint because it's the most ergonomically flowing process. You touch the paint and you know exactly how much you've made, rather than lift it from a separate device and pull it into the mixing area. Okay, in the next video I'll be looking at container mixing. That'll be lesson 5, this was lesson 4. This is Painting with Skill, Watercolour with Jason Skill. If you'd like to watch all of these in series, then I suggest you go to my website, jasonskill.com.